Most men believe the way to stay on a woman's mind is simple. Talk more, text more, try harder. They assume that if they just say the right things often enough, she'll eventually start thinking about them the same way. But here's the truth: most people never realize the men she actually remembers are rarely the ones who tried the hardest. They're the ones who said something small, simple, and unexpected. Something that stayed with her long after the conversation ended. Think about this for a second. Have you ever had someone say just a few words to you, and for some reason it stayed in your mind the entire day? You couldn't explain why, but it kept coming back, replaying itself quietly when everything else went silent. That's not random. That's how the mind works. People don't remember effort, they remember impact. And when it comes to attraction, impact doesn't come from talking more. It comes from saying something that creates a feeling, because at the end of the day, a woman doesn't remember every message you sent her. She remembers how you made her feel in that moment. That's what stays. That's what lingers. That's what pulls her back into thinking about you, even when you're not around. Now here's where it gets interesting. There are certain ways of speaking that trigger this effect naturally, not because they are complicated, not because they are perfect, but because they connect with something deeper than logic. They don't just sound good. They feel different, and once you understand this, everything about the way you communicate begins to change. You stop trying to impress, you stop overthinking every word, and instead you start creating moments that actually stay in her mind. That's what this video is really about. Not tricks, not lines, not pretending to be someone you're not, but understanding the psychology behind why some words disappear instantly while others stay long after the conversation is over. Before we go deeper, I want to know something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your country in the comments. It's always interesting to see how far these ideas travel, and how differently attraction is experienced around the world. Now, if most men are trying harder and still being forgotten, the real question becomes, what are they doing wrong? If you really pay attention to how most men approach attraction, you'll start to notice a pattern. They believe more effort equals more interest. So what do? They send more messages, they explain themselves more, they try harder to be funny, more interesting, more impressive, and on the surface it seems logical. If you want someone to think about you, you should give them more of you, right? But in reality, the opposite often happens. The more you try to force attention, the less impact you actually create. Because attraction doesn't grow from effort. It grows from how something makes someone feel. Think about it this way. If a woman receives 10 messages from you in a day, what happens? At first, she might respond, then she gets used to it, then it becomes normal, and eventually predictable. And once something becomes predictable, the brain stops paying attention to it. That's the part most men completely miss. The human mind is not designed to remember everything. It filters out what feels routine and focuses only on what feels different. So when your communication becomes constant, safe, and expected, you slowly fade into the background, not because you're not good enough, but because there's nothing emotionally stimulating for her mind to hold on to. Now here's where it gets deeper. Most men confuse attention with attraction. Just because she replies doesn't mean she's thinking about you later. Just because the conversation continues doesn't mean it left any impact. You can talk to someone all day and still be completely forgettable, because without emotional weight, words don't stick. They pass through. This is why trying harder often backfires. Long messages, over-explaining, constantly checking in. It doesn't build mystery, it removes it. It doesn't create curiosity, it answers everything too quickly, and when there's no curiosity, there's nothing for her mind to return to. Later, attraction needs space. It needs moments that feel slightly unfinished, slightly intriguing, slightly different from everything else she experiences. That's what creates replay. That's what makes her pause later and think, why did that stay with me? So the real problem isn't that most men don't care enough. It's that they're trying to create attraction using effort instead of understanding how the mind actually remembers. And once you understand how memory and emotion work together, you realize something powerful. It's not about saying more, it's about saying something that actually stays, and that leads us to the next important piece. Why some words disappear instantly while others leave a lasting imprint on her mind. To understand this, you need to understand how the brain actually works. Because the brain does not function like a recorder, it doesn't store every word or every conversation exactly as it happened. Instead, it filters, it keeps what feels important and discards what feels ordinary, and what determines what is important. Emotion. The brain is wired to remember experiences that create a feeling, not just happiness or excitement, but anything that stands out emotionally. Curiosity, surprise, tension, even confusion. That's what gets stored. That's what gets replayed. Think about your own life for a moment. You probably don't remember most conversations you had last week, but certain moments. Certain phrases. Certain interactions stayed with you, not because they were long, but because they made you feel something. That's what psychologists call emotional imprinting. When something triggers a feeling, the brain marks it as significant. It attaches meaning to it, and because of that, it becomes easier to recall later, even without trying. Now apply that to attraction, if your words don't create any emotional reaction. They simply pass through her awareness like background noise. She may respond in the moment, but there's nothing for her mind to return to afterward. But if something you say creates even a small emotional shift, curiosity, intrigue, a feeling she didn't expect, that's when the brain holds on to it. And here's what most people overlook: the brain doesn't just remember emotional moments, it revisits them. That replay is what creates attraction over time, not constant communication, not endless messages, but a single moment that stays alive in her mind after you're gone. This is why someone can say very little and still be unforgettable, because what they said carried weight. It created an internal reaction, and once that reaction exists, the brain keeps returning to it, trying to understand it, relive it, or feel it again. That's the difference between being someone she talks to and someone she thinks about. So when you focus on emotional impact instead of just conversation, everything changes. You stop trying to fill silence, you stop trying to say the perfect thing, and instead you begin to understand that a few well-placed words can do far more than 100 forgettable ones. And that brings us to the next mistake most men make: they rely on safe, polite communication without realizing it's the fastest way to become invisible. One of the biggest reasons most men become forgettable is because they rely on what feels safe: safe messages, safe questions, safe conversations. Hey, how are you? How was your day? Hope you're doing well. There's nothing wrong with these phrases. They're polite, respectful, they show basic interest, but here's the problem: they don't create any emotional reaction, and without emotion, there is no memory. Think about how many times a woman hears those same messages, not just from you, but from everyone else. They all sound the same, they all feel the same, so the brain treats them the same, it ignores them. Not because they're bad, but because they're predictable. This is what makes safe communication invisible. You're not standing out, you're blending in. Now here's the truth most men don't want to hear: you can be consistent, polite, and always available, and still be completely forgettable, because attraction isn't built on repetition, it's built on emotional contrast. Something that feels different from everything else she experiences. So instead of asking, am I saying the right things? A better question is, does what I'm saying create any feeling at all? Because if it doesn't, it won't stay, and once you understand that, you realize something powerful. It's not about being louder, longer, or more frequent. It's about creating a moment that interrupts the ordinary, and that leads us to the next piece. What actually triggers that emotional reaction in the first place? If safe words don't work, what actually makes something stick? It comes down to one thing: emotional triggers. These are the subtle moments in conversation that create a reaction without her even realizing why, not big dramatic emotions, but small shifts: curiosity, intrigue, a slight sense of mystery, because the mind doesn't replay what it fully understands, it replays what feels unfinished. When something is completely clear and predictable, the brain moves on, but when something feels slightly incomplete, slightly open-ended, the mind holds on to it. It starts asking questions. What did he mean by that? Why did that feel different? Why am I thinking about this again? That's the beginning of attraction, quiet curiosity that keeps returning. This is why mystery is powerful, not fake mystery, but simply not over-explaining everything. When you hint instead of explain, you give her mind space to engage, and the moment her mind becomes involved, she becomes emotionally invested. Another powerful trigger is imagery. Words that create a picture in her mind stay longer than words that simply pass through her ears, because now she's not just hearing you, she's experiencing something internally, and the brain always prioritizes internal experience over external information. Then there's unexpectedness, the moment something breaks the pattern. The brain pays attention, that's what creates impact, and once you understand this, you realize something even more powerful. You don't need to say more, you need to say less. But better, and that leads to the next principle most men struggle with. Why doing less often creates more impact than doing more. Once you understand emotional triggers, your entire approach to communication shifts. You realize it's not about doing more. It's about doing less with intention. Constant presence removes anticipation, and without anticipation, attraction fades. If she always knows you'll reply instantly, if you're always available, if every conversation continues without pause, there's nothing for her to wonder about, nothing to miss, and when there's nothing to miss, there's nothing to feel. This is why space is powerful, not because you're playing games, but because space allows emotions to develop naturally. After a meaningful moment, silence gives the mind time to replay it, to feel it, to revisit it. That's where attraction grows, not in constant conversation, but in the silence that follows. Most men interrupt this process. They send another message, they explain themselves, they try to keep momentum going, and in doing that, they remove the very thing that would have made her think about them later. The mind needs space to process. Without it, even the most interesting words lose their impact. And when you combine emotional impact, space, and something even more powerful, you create a completely different level of attraction, because the next piece is what makes your words stand out instantly. The power of novelty. The mind is constantly scanning for what is different, not what is common, not what is expected. But what breaks the pattern? When something feels different, the brain pauses, it pays attention, it marks that moment. This is called pattern interruption, and it's exactly what most men fail to do. They follow the same scripts, same greetings, same compliments, same predictable conversations, and because of that, they disappear. But the moment your words feel different, you become noticeable, not because you tried harder, but because you broke the pattern. Now here's the key. Difference alone is not enough. It must carry emotional weight, something unexpected. That also creates a feeling. That's what sticks. And when you combine emotional impact, space, and novelty, you arrive at something simple, but incredibly powerful, the three words that trigger all of it. Now we come to the part most people have been waiting for, the three words. But before I tell you what they are, understand this. They don't work because of how they sound. They work because of what they create in her mind. The goal is not to impress her. The goal is to make her feel something. And think about it later. So here they are. I noticed that. Simple, not dramatic, not complicated, but incredibly powerful when used the right way, because these words do something most men fail to do. They make her feel seen. In a specific, personal way. Instead of saying you're beautiful, you say, I noticed that you smile differently when you're really enjoying yourself. Feel the difference. One is generic, the other is personal. It creates a moment. And more importantly, it creates a question in her mind. When did he notice that? What else does he notice about me? That's where the real attraction begins, because now her mind starts replaying the interaction, not because you said a lot, but because what you said meant something. These words create imagery. They place her into a moment where she becomes aware of herself through your perspective, and that is a powerful emotional trigger, because people are naturally drawn to those who make them feel understood on a deeper level. Another example. I noticed you don't follow the crowd, or I noticed you think before you speak. These aren't just compliments, they're observations, and observations feel real. They show attention, they show presence, they show that you see something others might have missed, and once a woman Anne feels seen in that way, you become memorable, not because you tried to impress her, but because you made her feel understood.